Okay, this is Wrong Side Up, Part 3, where we left off. When we left off, Bud was recounting to William how he had managed to catch up to him when he jumped off the train the night before, and the wound that he had received, and all those kinds of things. And the last thing he said was, "But I'm done talking. Go ahead and do something about my leg." He lay back on his bale of straw, and I studied that wound for a few minutes. When I would touch his leg near the wound, he would jerk. So I said, "I don't know, boy. This will hurt, as it has to be probed. There seems to be something in there." "Well, what are you waiting for?" he said. "Go ahead." After washing his leg once more, a knife was sterilized by holding it above the flame of a match, and I started the first operation of my career. I no more than started digging with that knife when he howled and jumped about a foot. "Boy, that hurts! What are you trying to do to me anyway?" I then explained that I could see some foreign material in there, and again he said, "Well, go ahead, dig it out." But he first pulled a button from his coat sleeve, and with this firmly fixed between his teeth, he growled again, "Go ahead." This time he took it, and the first thing that came out was a piece of overall goods that had dragged into the wound. The railroad car swayed back and forth considerably, and as I could not hold the knife steady, the wound became larger every probe I made. The blood began to flow also, and that made it more difficult, with the lantern swaying, then again in the shadow, and then out. After a few more tries, he said, "Enough, let me alone." We then discussed bandages and not being prepared for this sort of thing. Naturally, no bandage was to be had, but a few clean handkerchiefs were torn into strips, and we decided to put a poultice on it during the night. Poultice material was also scarce, but having a bar of laundry soap, it was decided to make a paste of this. Since Bud had heard that tobacco was also good for open wounds, a pinch of that was added to the paste. Now to apply this took a moment, and quickly wrapping the bandage to hold the paste in place, we decided to get some sleep. I slept like a log once I hit my straw bale, but the patient did not fare so well. When that poultice started to take hold, it kept him awake all night. In the morning, the leg was unwrapped and the poultice washed away. The swelling had gone down, but the wound looked ugly. So after washing it again, we decided to probe some more. The coat button again served as a local anesthetic, and the probing soon disclosed something solid. At first, I was not sure whether I was digging into his leg bone or not, but I pried away, and suddenly out popped a piece of wood, the thickness of a lead pencil and 3/4 inches long. The bleeding then began in earnest, but by continual bathing that finally stopped. My patient was as white as a sheet, but I'll admit that he was tough. Since all of this was done while in motion in a swaying boxcar, the reader can readily understand why I made several miss-stabs and punctured a few new holes around the wound. But a new poultice was applied, and after a day or two my buddy was hobbling around again. In the meantime, we had crossed Minnesota and were in North Dakota. Our boxcar had a steel roof, and it was fiery hot in there in the daytime and real cool at night, even in July. Thus, we had a foretaste of what was in store for us. I would jump out and lock him in when we would pull into a siding near a town and quickly run to get some groceries. As for our water supply, the engine would usually pull alongside to give me water from its tank, and I would fill the 2 barrels we had with us. We soon found out that having a small board floating on top would eliminate a lot of the slopping and waste, as water was hard to get at some stops. So we slowly drifted west until we finally crossed the state and entered Montana. I had made the trip before, my train passenger, with one of the groups of some homeseekers, and as the train we then were on was one of the fastest of its time, we didn't realize how large Montana really was. It was now 9 days since we left home, and 2 more days were spent traveling in Montana. So it took us, with our delay in the Chicago stockyards, 11 days to make that trip of 1,400 miles. We had not figured on so many days, and our feed had long run out. Thus our horses had their first western hay along in the Dakotas somewhere. Most of the train men on the last 1,000 miles knew we were together, and good sports they were indeed. For with my partner in such bad condition, I had to do all of the running, and he would have been in a fix if I had been obliged to leave him. On the 11th day, about noon, we pulled into our new town and at once began unloading the horses. They were very shaky on their feet and stood braced even on the ground, afraid that they would be jerked and bumped again. But after walking them around a while, they soon got their legs under control, and we decided to load up a small load on our wagon and to start for the section. We knew the number of the section was 21, but that was all that we knew about it. We had no idea that it lay out there where it lay out there in the miles, 22 miles from the railroad. The wagon we soon set up, and the pigs were shooed back into their original crate. Some farm implements were loaded, and the team harnessed. The other harness was thrown on the wagon, and with 2 horses tied behind, we started off, after inquiring where the road was, to the Holland settlement, as it was then already called. After a mile or so, we noticed that the horses were puffing like steam engines, and soon found that we had to stop occasionally to let them get their wind, little realizing that we had transported them from an altitude of 700 feet to one of 4,400 feet above sea level. This was too much for our eastern horses, as we soon found out. After leaving the valley, a steady climb of 10 miles brought us to an immense hill, which was the gateway to the bench lands above which the Holland settlement was to be. Our first team was completely fagged out by now, and as dusk was approaching, we decided to try the other horses who had trotted and walked along behind. As our eastern wagon had no brakes, we would dash down one hill and try to make the next one all in one pull. But when the hill was reached, we realized that it would be some job to get to the top. "How far is it after we get up there?" says Bud, gazing toward the top. "Oh," I said, "not far. From the top you can see the house where we're going to stop overnight." We decided that our load was too large for the first try, so we unloaded some of the stuff at the foot of the hill, not worrying about not finding it later, because too much was just too much, and that was all there was to that. I was elected to walk behind the wagon, carrying a large boulder, which I was to slip in back of one of the hind wheels whenever the horses stopped, since Bud's leg was bothering him. So at last all was set. We made the first rise, and then a turn to the next ascent brought the horses up sharply, and immediately the wagon came rolling back. I jumped to my station and slipped my rock behind the wheel, glad to get rid of it, as I also was puffing of the exertion of trying to keep up with the wagon and carrying the boulder as well. The next hitch was only about 30 feet, and again the horses stopped. I hardly got a good hold of my boulder, and again the wagon came back at me. Puffing with Bud hollering at the horses, I finally got set, but we had lost about 10 feet. Just then, looking ahead of the team and seeing what was still before us gave me the creeps, and I thought, the team may make it, but I never will, as by then my heart was pounding like a trip hammer. The horses' sides were heaving in and out, and their nostrils were wide open, showing red. My friend glanced back at me, and all of a sudden he began delivering his first sermon of a series on the foolishness of this whole undertaking. "Why," he says, "didn't you ever see this hill before when you were here? Anyone that would buy land up on top there must have been blind or crazy. Where was Dad's common sense, if you didn't have any, to buy land in such a forsaken wilderness?" I didn't say much, but tried to explain that the land agents had taken us out there in autos, and we had not even noticed a hill. After about 5 minutes of this, we decided to give it another go. The team was willing enough, but after about 50 feet suddenly halted again. I scrambled with my boulder and slipped in behind the wheel, but this time the wheel bounced right on over it, and the wagon and team came backing down the hill. I looked around among the scrub pines, which were growing all over the slopes, for another rock, but too late. The wagon got twisted in the trail and soon landed crosswise among the pines, where the rear axle hooked on an old stump. This saved the whole mess from rolling clear down to the bottom. With a sigh, the driver came off of his high perch and delivered sermon number 2. This took another 5 minutes, and then we decided to let the works hang there and go on ahead with the horses only. The harness was removed, and the horses looked at us with grateful eyes. I guess they thought, "Now, you're really showing some sense." These horses had never seen a hill like that in their lives, and here they were pulling a load up and only 5 hours out of a boxcar. Our enthusiasm was slowly running out as we plodded up the rest of the hill. It had become dark, and on reaching the top, the horses were spent again. Way off, we could see a light, and I said, "That's where we're going, and it looks like it's about 2 miles off." Yes, he thought so too, and each on a horse and leading another, we headed for the light. There were no regular roads then, as we knew them in the east. They were simply trails, following the ridges and hogbacks, as they're called. Bridges had not been built over the creeks or streams. They were crossed by fording on the likeliest-looking spot. After riding this way for about a mile, the light did not seem to come any closer, and Bud began sermon number 3 on the foolishness of mankind. We trudged slowly on, and after hours of this, with an occasional application from my partner, it began to look as if the light became brighter. The horses walked slower and slower, their heads hanging down. "They're disgusted with us," says Bud, "for taking them on this wild goose chase." Suddenly the light disappeared, and we had lost our beacon. We then headed in the general direction of where it was last seen, for our friends must have gone to bed. We finally arrived on the ranch yard, and the sound of our horses' hooves on that hard-packed yard brought the man out of bed to see what was going on. He recognized me, and after putting our tired horses in his lean-to barn, we went into the house and tried to explain where we had left our wagon. He understood the situation at once, perhaps having gone through the same experience a year or two earlier. "Don't worry about it," he said. "We'll get it in the morning. It's only 12 miles from here." Partner looked at me, but then decided not to preach any more that night. We were given some blankets and rolled in on the floor. The following morning, we learned that this upland was 1,000 feet higher than the railroad, and also learned that we were 2 miles from Section 21, the land of our destination. At first, we worried about our boxcar, but finally decided that it was impossible to load it all and haul it in the days allotted without paying demurrage. A man went with us to Big Hill, and starting from the bottom, we picked up the stuff that had been thrown off until we got to the wagon. The rancher had sent 4 horses with us to haul our wagon behind his, so at last the load arrived on the rancher's yard. The next day, our horses being rested, we made another trip to town but stayed in the boxcar overnight. We got an early start the next day. We brought the pigs with us that second trip, and on arriving at the ranch early in the afternoon, we decided to find our own location. The rancher went with us to find a spring of water so we could build our camp near water. We found a spring, as springs were plentiful that wet year, and dumped all of our stuff on a hillside above the spring. When our final load was hauled, a week had sped by, and still we had no lumber with which to build a shack. The pigs had been dumped near camp, and a few slats knocked off the cage so that they could use it as a coop. They stayed around the camp the first 2 weeks, and we fed them some grain brought from town. They became a regular nuisance to us, and many times we wished them back in Indiana. As we had no tent and the weather was still warm, a tent was made of the one bed we had by wiring a pole on each end upright with a pole from one to the other. Over this, we stretched a canvas so our tent was as large as the bed. Under the bed went our suitcases and grub box. Those 5 little pigs soon found out how to get onto that bed, and many evenings we would have to chase the pigs out before we could crawl in. Finally, they left us for good, and for 6 weeks we did not know whether the coyotes got them or not. But one night, as I came in from hunting rabbits, I heard some noises near the old hog crate, and sure enough, they had come back, but they were too big to all get back in the crate, so they were pushing and crowding to see who would sleep out. We began hauling lumber at once and came back often, finding everything upset by cattle roaming the country. They would smell our salt and dump everything trying to find it. This caused us to hurry our building operations, which consisted of a barn large enough to hold 10 horses, one corner of which we boarded up to serve as our living quarters. As we were now well into August, it became apparent that not much actual farming could be done this year. Our tools and plows proved no good for this heavy soil, and our horses could not pull a plow through that soil. Word to this effect had been sent back east, and while we were hauling lumber, much time was consumed, as 3 trips a week was all our horses could stand. We would go in one day and come back the next. To save expenses, we would sleep in the livery barn, sometimes in empty mangers, and then again upstairs in the haymow. This expense grew as new settlers came, for the liveryman took advantage of them, knowing that they had no hay or feed of their own. Now this worked all right as long as the weather was mild, but as fall weather set in, many a cold night was spent in that hayloft of the livery barn in town. As only one blanket was carried on the wagon seat, no other covering was to be had. Hotel rates were high, and our Dutch people thought that room rent was so much money thrown away. Some of our people can tell stories of getting out of that haymow during the night and stamping up and down the street to get some life back into their chilled bodies. The hotel keepers did not like this very well, and began putting pressure on the liveryman, using the fire hazard as an excuse to expel men from sleeping there, and thus forcing them into the hotels. I have slept there in I slept there in the hay when there were at least 20 men up there, and that would have meant 10 rooms at the hotel at $250 each.